And I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Hopefully, everyone can now see the presentation that's up on the screen. So welcome, everyone. I want to just introduce myself. My name is Jeremy Lehmann, and I live in Westchester County, north of New York City. My mom is Susan Weinberger Lehmann, and her mother is Anita. And Anita's mother, my maternal line great grandmother, is Betty Nositzer Brandner, and we're going to be talking about her ancestry tonight. I have been interested in genealogy now for about 5 years. And it's become almost like a second job for me. I'm really passionate about it. I work on building out my tree basically every single day, and there are now over 26,000 people on the tree. So it's really quite big. And if anyone wants an invite to the tree, I'm more than welcome to send them an invite. But I find that it can be really overwhelming for people to just look through the tree. And so periodically, I will put together presentations summarizing material from the presentation. And so tonight we're going to talk about Betty Nositzer and her ancestry. This is the culmination of years of research, as you'll see. And I hope you guys, we'll learn a lot tonight. If you need to drop off because it's too long, feel free to do so. We are also going to be talking about the Holocaust tonight because that features very prominently in her ancestry. And so, if any point you want to mute and you don't want to listen to a video, feel free to do so as well because some of the content is going to be Holocaust related tonight. All right. So, without further ado, let's start the presentation about our Mezritch ancestry. All right, so as an introduction, I want to talk a little bit about my great-grandmother, Betty Nositzer Brandner, and, she was my longest living direct ancestor. She lived almost to the age of 104 years old, and she's the great-grandparent, because of that, who I got to know the best. I have really fond memories of going to her apartment in Brooklyn and doing math problems with her as a kid and visiting her when she was older in Massachusetts as well. And, I've always wanted to research her ancestry. Unfortunately, a lot of people knew about where her ancestry was from, including my grandfather, Howard. And, he told me and other people told me that oh, well, her parents were both from the same town called Mezritch in eastern Poland. The town in Polish, you can see the spelling there, is called Międzyrzec Podlaski, but it's known in Yiddish as Mezritch. And so I'm going to be referring to the town as Mezritch because it's a little bit easier to pronounce. But what you have here is a family tree of Betty and her 3 children. You can see pictures of her children who are all here on the call. And Betty had 2 siblings, a sister Sadie and a brother Sam. And I did try to invite people from all 3 branches. It looks like we've got representation from 2 of them tonight. And this is a picture of Betty's parents who we're going to talk about. Morris Nositzer, who was born Morris Nositchka. Moshko Aaron is his Hebrew name, Moshe Aaron. And then his wife is Eva Beerman, and her Hebrew name, Yiddish name was Yenta Rivka. And so we're going to talk about the Nositchkas, which is the Nositzer line, and about the Beerman line tonight. So let's talk about Mezritch, which is this town that our ancestry is from. So when I started digging into the different lines of ancestry, I found it quite interesting that most of the lines of ancestry were all from the same very small region in eastern Poland. You can see I've labeled them here, all these different towns. Most of the ancestral lines were actually from Mezritch, going back over 200 years. But there were a few other towns where some of our direct ancestors are from, and I've listed them. Aviva Podlaska, Janov Podlaski, Konstantinov, and this town here in the blue, which is a little bit further away, called Stebrzeszyn. So all of our ancestry from Grandma Betty are from these towns going back 200 years. And they're all from a very small, area in eastern Poland today. So I wanted to spend just a couple slides with some broader history about the Mezritch region. And it's important to sort of to go over this history because it features prominently in terms of the history of the development of the town. So if you go back to the 18th century, back in the 1700s, Mezritch was a town that was part of a very big country called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth extended all the way west to western Poland today, and it extended east all the way to areas of Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. And most of the European Jews lived in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the 1700s. It was a very, very welcoming to Jews, and Jews basically flourished there. They had a lot of autonomy in the 1700s in a way that they didn't quite have in other areas of Europe. But the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth basically was very weak. And by the late 18th century, three bigger empires were starting to carve it up and take it for their own. And they call it the partitions of Poland. There were three of them, starting in the 1770s and ending in 1795 with the third partition. And in the west, western Poland became part of Prussia. Southern Poland became part of the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the eastern part became part of the Russian Empire. It's interesting, when people say, oh, they have like Russian ancestry and Russian Jews, there were actually no Jews living in Russia prior to this partition. So prior to the 1770s, all of the Jews were living in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they were not part of Russia. But depending on where you were in Poland, your trajectory went in very different directions. I've talked about this in other presentations that I've given. I have a family that was part of all three different regions, and they had very different trajectories in terms of their development during the 1800s. So what happened to Mezritch? It's very interesting. Mezritch in 1795 finally was taken over, and it was taken over by the Austrians. It was actually part of the southern region of Poland that got taken over by the Austrians. And it wasn't really a great time during those about a decade or so that it was under Austrian rule. Austrians sort of took away the Jewish autonomy in the region. They instituted a lot of high taxes. It wasn't all that great for about a decade. And then from 1809 to 1815, during the Napoleonic Wars, it actually was part of a separate entity called the Duchy of Warsaw, which was a client state of Napoleon. It was only a few years, like 6 years, but it was during this time that vital records got introduced to the town of Mezritch. And there were a lot of equality that was introduced to Jews during this 6-year period that was subsequently taken away afterwards. But in 1815, so after Napoleon was defeated, this region became part of a new entity that was really under Russia. So it had been under Austria. It was sort of independent, but a client state of Napoleon for 6 years. But then starting in 1815, it became part of the Congress Poland, which was a semi-autonomous Polish state ruled over by Russia. It was really a Russian entity. It was separate from the Russian Pale of Settlement, though, which had important ramifications. The Russian Pale of Settlement was just to the east of this area, and Jews had more autonomy here in Congress Poland than they did in this Pale of Settlement. They were able to move more freely than they were, let's say, in Russia, in the Pale of Settlement. But during the course of the 19th century, Russia exerted its influence on the Congress Poland, and it gradually became absorbed as part of the Russian Empire. And as a result of some uprisings, first in the 1830s, And then in the 1860s, Russia basically strengthens its grip on the Congress Poland. And we actually see this in terms of the vital records. Starting in 1869, before 1869, all of the records are in Polish. But because they were worried about Polish independence and Poles fighting against them, they enforced the Russian language to be on all documentation starting in 1869, and that continued up until World War One. So the Jewish population in Congress Poland was quite large. There's a census in 1897 that enumerated all of them, and there was 1.25 million Jews, constituting 13% of the population in 1897. So again, between 1815 and the end of World War One, it was a part of Russia, and then after World War One, Mezritch and the broader Congress Poland region became part of the independent country of Poland. It was part of Poland up until the outbreak of World War II. So here is actually a map of the Congress Poland, and Mezritch is over here in this dark blue region to the east of this town, Szydlce. All right. So that's about the broader region of Mezritch in the Congress Poland. Let's talk a little bit about the town of Mezritch. So Mezritch had a large Jewish community going back at least to the middle 17th century. It's actually believed that there probably were Jews living there during the 1500s and 1600s. The reason why we say with certainty from the middle 17th century is that the middle of the 1600s was a tumultuous time for this area of Poland. There was what's called the Chmielnicki revolts in 1647, which was an uprising of peasants, of Cossacks, and then there were the Swedes who invaded Poland, and it was a very tumultuous time for Catholics, and also for the Catholic clergy, and also for Jews. But starting in the 1660s and early 1670s, we know there was a Jewish presence again in Mezritch. And in the 1700s, there was this beautiful synagogue called the Great Synagogue that was built. It took apparently 18 years to build, from the 1760s and 1770s, and it housed 3,000 people, 3,000 worshipers in this synagogue, which is again, very, very large synagogue. We have a picture of the Holy Ark that was from this synagogue. There was a fire in the synagogue in 1847, but the building was not destroyed. And in fact, the building still remained after World War II. It still existed for quite some time. During the second half of the 19th century, so now we're moving into the 1800s, a Jewish working class emerged, finding employment in a few different areas. But Mezritch, especially starting in the second half of the 1800s into the 20th century, became known for two distinct trades. One was pig bristle manufacturing, and the other one was hide tanning with leathers, with furs and leathers. So by 1906, there was a survey that indicated that in Mezritch, there were 3,000 workers in bristle manufacturing. And that accounted for half of all the workers in all of Russia and Poland. It was like a very concentrated industry during this time. And Mezritch also was famous for tanning and for several types of hides. So as we fast forward to the outbreak of World War II, over 12,000 residents were Jewish, accounting for 75% of the town's population. All right. So I wanted to introduce our first clip of the night. And this is courtesy of an interview from 25 years ago from a cousin of ours. We're going to talk about him a little bit, about his family a little bit, but he's a more distant cousin. His name was Yitzchak Itzka, but he later went by Irving Vishna. And he was born in Mezritch and grew up in Mezritch and survived the Holocaust. And he talks in this 1-minute clip about these trades, the work occupations in Mezritch and what they were known for. So hopefully this will go off without a glitch and you'll be able to hear this clip.
Tell me about the town that you live in. Now, we live in a Jewish town. There was by 18,000 Jews in Mezritch. The town was, in that time, that was an industry town. the most production in the town was bristle dressing. By 8,000 Jews worked by dressing the bristles in little private primitive factories.
What does dressing mean?
Because the bristles you have to clean, to wash, to select the sizes, the stiffness, the colors, to make them should be able to make from them paintbrushes. The bristles, in the second thing which was very popular with a lot of people live on this was for export. Mezritch used to buy a lot of fur in over the country. In from Mezritch they went in other countries. For example, the same thing, the bristles, the production bristles went to Germany, to America, into other countries in the world.
All right. So just to summarize, hopefully you were able to hear that, but he talked about the two different industries of fur and of bristle making. We're going to go to the next slide here.
Okay.
And I've got a video clip here, and it is in Hebrew, and I will, afterwards, I will describe it. But what I want to show here is there is a documentary that was made about 20 plus years ago, around 2000, by Israeli descendants of Mezritch survivors from the Holocaust. And they were filmmakers, and they made a short film about life in Mezritch. And in this film, you're going to see what this pig bristle making was all about. You'll see what it actually looks like. Because for me, it was very hard to wrap my head around this very niche industry to learn about it. So look for the visuals. This, I understand with Zoom, there will be a little bit of a lag, but you should be able to see the video clip. And then I will quickly I have all of it described, all of it translated on the slide, but I'll quickly just run through it. So let's watch this video clip from this movie called Little America.
אמרו חז"ל, אם אין קמח, אין תורה. תורה ותרבות היו במזריץ'. היו. בתי ספר, בתי כנסיות, מכאן שגם קמח היה. ומפה הגיע הקמח. שערות החזיר.
כן, כן, פעם לפני עידן הניילון והפלסטיק ושאר המוצרים הסינתטיים, רוב המברשות המשובחות בעולם עשויות היו משיער של חזיר. חזיר זה טמא, טפו, ובשר חזיר זה פיגול, טפו טפו. אבל מברשות משיער חזיר זה כשר. כשר, אבל מסריח.
שערות חזיר זה היה הדגל של מזריץ'. קודם כל זה התחיל במיון, וזה היה שלבים, היו צריכים גם לחוץ אותם, להוציא מהם את השומן, להלבין אותם, לעבד אותם, שכל מידה של שערה תהיה בנבחת. המוצר המוגמר, היו שולחים קודם כל לאירופה. המקום המרכזי זה היה גרמניה, לייפציג. שם היה תערוכות פעמיים בשנה, ועבדו רק בשביל לספק את הסחורה לזמן של התערוכה. וכאשר הסוחרים האלו שחזרו מלייפציג הביאו בחזרה כל מיני דברים, ומה שכל העיירות של פולניה מהסביבה שלנו לא ידעו על זה ולא ראו דברים כאלו.
ולמה קראו לכם אמריקה הקטנה?
אמריקה הקטנה זה היה מקור של פרנסה בשביל העיר.
All right, so what we just heard here was a little bit of a background on the pig bristles. So what's interesting is that, in Jewish halachic law, Jews are forbidden from eating pig meat or even using pig products, but it happened to be acceptable to make bristles out of pig hair. And so they explained that the process was quite smelly. You had to sort the hairs, wash the hairs, remove the oil, bleach them, and then process them to a uniform length. The product was then exported all over Europe. And it was such a big industry in Mezritch that the residents in Mezritch, called the town Little America because it was so prosperous. And people achieved, economic success in that trade. So I thought it was useful to be able to see that and visualize the work that was done in these little individual factories making these pig bristles. All right, so we're going to move on to the slide about Mezritch during the Holocaust. So unfortunately, the Jewish community was greatly devastated by the Holocaust. And so just to give a brief overview of what happened during the Holocaust in Mezritch, at the onset of the war, which was in September of 1939, the Germans invaded and the Russians invaded Poland concurrently. And during the very early part of the war, Mezritch switched hands between the Russians and then the Germans. And so the Germans actually took over the town on October 9th, 1939, and the city was transferred to the Gestapo a couple weeks later. And what the Nazis did first, they put on a high tax on the Jewish community and held Jews hostages until it was paid. Jews were then expelled from their homes, and they were sent to live in a ghetto, which was a poorer area of the town. Jews had to wear a white armband with the Star of David on it. And then, fast forward a couple years, beginning in August of 1942 and going through July of 1943, there were 7 actions that took place in which the town was emptied of its Jewish residents, and most were murdered during this time. So, going to June of 1944, there was a battle for the city between the Russian Soviets, who were now against the Germans, and they took over the city in June of 1944. So this is a good amount of time before the war ended. The following year, it was recaptured by the Soviets, but by that time, less than 1% of the Jewish population managed to survive the war. It's an astounding figure to think about. Over 99% of the Jewish community in Mezritch died at the hands of the Nazis. And this number of survivors includes those who went to concentration camps, those who were able to get to Russia before or during the war, and those who lived in forests or were hidden by local families. I have a little link here that you can learn about more about the Mezritch history. But again, the Jewish community was decimated and destroyed by the Holocaust. So now we've talked about the broader history of the town and the region. Let's talk about our ancestry. And what's really wonderful about Mezritch is that Jewish vital records exist going all the way back to about 1810, over 200 years. And since so much of my great-grandmother Betty's ancestry was from Mezritch itself, this allowed us to trace back many of her lines of ancestry. So in fact, you can see it here on the right, I have been able to determine all 16 of her second great-grandparents. We actually know all of her parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and second great-grandparents, which are 16 of them. And all of them were born late 1700s to early 1800s. So we know all of her lines of ancestry. It's complete. These second great-grandparents are my fifth great-grandparents, and it's the most complete area of my entire tree. None of my other ancestors are this complete. And the reason for that is that in a lot of other Jewish regions, you don't actually have records that go back this far. That's the main thing, is that you don't have records that go back this far. So it's really a treasure trove of records that I was able to utilize to be able to trace back so many different lines. And just to familiarize yourself with some of the surnames that we're going to talk about tonight. So Betty's paternal line was Nositzer, but beforehand in Poland, the name was Noziczka. Noziczka was the name. Sometimes you may hear it as Noziczki. But in the spelling in Polish, it's almost always Noziczka. In Yiddish, you sometimes see Noziczki, which are just different endings. Usually they denote like male or female, endings to a Polish word. So that's Noziczka. And then on her paternal grandmother's side, we're going to talk a lot about this family too, the Vishnyas. They also were from Mezritch. Rivka Gittel was her grandmother. And then on her mother's side, we have the Beermans, who were a very long-established family in Mezritch. We'll talk a little bit about that, but the records for this family go back the furthest, for this Beerman family. And then on her maternal grandmother's side was the Weinstein family, which also was a family from Mezritch. So all of her grandparents were from Mezritch, And you have to really go back further in time to find some of these other neighboring towns where her ancestry is from. We're going to talk about, again, all of these different families. What I find interesting is that, you'll notice on her paternal side that some of these surnames are actually Polish, which is actually quite unusual. You don't usually see that in Jewish surnames. You don't see a lot of Polish surnames. I actually looked it up. And Noziczki in Polish means scissors, and Vishna in Polish means cherry, and these are Polish surnames. Okay, so what's the importance of these vital records? Vital records, again, are birth, marriage, and death records from the town, and they are among the most important documents when you're doing genealogy research. Obviously, they are the primary sources for important dates in people's lives, but you can also learn a lot of other useful information from these records. So what types of information can you find? Well, vital records for Mezritch and these other surrounding towns. You can learn about people's handwriting. You can see people's signatures, ancestors' signatures. You can learn about their occupations, and you can get a sense for whether they were able to read or write. And from witness names, we can find out other family members sometimes. And before 1868, as I said, from 1868 and beforehand, going back to 1810, these records are in Polish, which is in Latin script, which is much easier for us to read since it uses a lot of similar letters to English. But starting in 1869, they are in Russian, which uses which uses Cyrillic. It's in cursive, and it's much more difficult to decipher. And it's a language that I'm less familiar with. And so, there's still a lot more work for me to do to go through the records from 1869 through World War I that are in Russian, because it's much more laborious process for me to go through those records. So I want to go through some examples of some of the records that exist. I wanted to give just a couple highlights for you. So the first one here on the top right is a birth record for Betty's paternal grandmother, who we're going to talk about, Rivka Gittel Vishna. And it's dated the 13th of March, 1857. So that's when she was born. Now, what's interesting is we see here that she's actually not the only one mentioned here. There's also another baby girl who's mentioned. Rivka Gittel was in fact a twin, which we never knew. She had a twin sister named Esther, who did not survive infancy and who passed away. But we see in this birth record that Rivka Gittel, who was the one of the older siblings in her family, she was in fact a twin. On the bottom here is a cousin of Rivka Gittel named Kisiel Vishna. And I include this birth record. He's only a few years younger than Rivka Gittel, but you see that his name is Wolf Vishna, and he does not sign his name. You see these little 3 circles with a dash. Sometimes that indicates that he was not able, so that person who's signing, the father, Kissel's father, Wolf, that he was not able to read and write. So it might indicate that that's the case. You see this oftentimes in other places in Europe too. If someone couldn't read or write, they would do this little circles with a line through it, just to mark that they couldn't do that. I guess maybe one other thing to note here is, Rivka Gittel's birth record, we actually have her father's signature on here. This is Betty's great-grandfather's signature. His name was Berko Vishna, and he signed his name in Yiddish. Okay, this is one I really like too. This is a birth record of Betty's maternal line great-grandmother. So my maternal line great-grandmother is Betty, and Betty's maternal line great-grandmother is a woman by the name of Basha Bluma Biebergal, and Grandma Betty is named after this woman, after her great-grandmother. She's named after this woman, and she was born in October of 1839. So you see this beautiful birth record for Betty's namesake, Basha Bluma Biebergal. What I love about this document, a few things. The signatures are really incredible. We see Bluma's father's signature over here, Shlomo Biebergal. This is the father. And her grandfather's signature, whose name was Abu Spiebergal. Again, these would be Betty's second great-grandparent and third great-grandfather who had their signatures on here. The other person who signed was the father, Shlomo Biebergal's brother-in-law, whose name was Feivel Degenschein. So all of the people who signed on this document were all family members, and it's pretty amazing to see their signatures. These are people, someone like Abus was born in the 1700s, which is, again, pretty amazing. So those were some birth records that we saw. I also wanted to show just some marriage records that exist. I just included two of them. These are the marriage records of Betty's great-grandparents. One of them is Shlomo Biederman to Etla Weinberg, and the other one is Berko Vishna, which is Rivka Gittel's father, to a woman named Matala Nissenbaum. And so you can see some more signatures on this document on the left. They're from two different towns. This one was from Biała Podlaska, and this one is from Mezritch. But again, these are records from the 1840s and 1850s of marriage records. And you learn about lots of different things. For instance, here, like the groom, Shlomo Biederman, he was an innkeeper. We learn his occupation from this record. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide. This is one of my favorite slides of the presentation. One of the really amazing things that going back in the records allows you to do is to see the adoption of surnames. And what does that mean? Well, unlike the Christian population in Europe, which had surnames going back for many centuries, the Jewish population in most areas of Europe, they generally adopted their surnames much more recently. Almost all areas of Europe, Jews adopted surnames just in the last 200 to 250 years. While some residents of Mezritch had surnames by 1810, most of them did not take on surnames until the early 1820s. So what were people named before they had surnames? Before they had last names, what did people call each other? Well, all of the Jewish communities, they made use of patronyms, which is, for me, okay, because my father's name is Richard, they would call me Jeremy Richard, or Jeremy, son of Richard. That would be my name. I wouldn't be having the last name Lehmann. I would be Jeremy Richard. That would be my name. And same would be the case for the daughters. For women, they would also include their father's name. Always the father's name would be included as the last name. Now, if you're a genealogist and you're given this patronym, unfortunately, it makes research extremely hard because everyone has this, there are a lot of people who will share a first name, and it makes it much more difficult to trace lineages before the adoption of surnames. But we're fortunate in a few places. In our tree, we actually can see records transform from the patronyms to the surnames that exist in the modern world. So I want to talk about it in the Beerman family, which again is Betty's mother's, Grandma Eva's paternal line. And we're going to talk about a few documents where we see the patronym, and then we see it transition into the Biederman surname. So over here in the top left, we have a death record. It's Betty's third great-grandfather's death record. His name was Hirsch. And there is no Biederman last name here. As you see here, it says Hirschka Gedala. That is a patronym. It means that Hirsch's father was a guy named Gedala, and that Hirsch died in 1821. So we can say by 1821, the Biederman surname had not been adopted at that point. Fast forward 1 year later, okay? And in 1822, Hirsch's son gets married. His name is Usher. He gets married in a town where his wife is from, Leah Montag. It's from this very difficult town to pronounce. It looks crazy because there's no vowels, but the name of the town is pronounced Szczebrzeszyn, which is a little bit further south in the Congress, Poland. And in 1822, we see the first surname get introduced. So this is just a year later. And what did Usher call himself? He is named in this marriage record Usher Hershkovitz. So Usher's son of Hirsch. But he has a surname, and it's not Beerman. He had adopted a different surname in 1822 called Bavelstein. Bavelstein means in Yiddish, the stone of Babylon. And he had decided that that was going to be his last name. He liked the last name Bavelstein. I like it a lot too, honestly. I think it's a really, really cool last name. It is such a unique surname. No one else in the world, okay, no one else in the world had this surname or has had this surname since. It is such a unique surname, Bavelstein. But guess what? He wasn't the only person who was adopting surnames, right? All of his family was adopting surnames in the early 1820s. And guess what? Everyone else in his family started calling themselves Beerman. And so, I don't include it here, but 2 years later, when he has his first child, he's already changed his last name to Biederman, so he can be like all the other Biedermans. So for about a year or two, he had this last name, Bavelstein. But I wanted to include Hirsch's father, who is, again, Betty's fourth great-grandfather. He lived a very long life, and he died in 1830. And in that record, in Mezritch, we see here Biederman. So between, let's say, 1824 and 1830, that is when the Biederman surname got established. And Biederman means honorable, upright man in both German and Yiddish. So we see this transformation from the patronym to a patronym and a surname that no one else in the family liked. And then the surname changes to Biederman, and it becomes the established surname for that family. So since we were talking about the Biedermans, I want to spend a couple slides here talking about the Beerman family, which is Betty's mother's family. So her maternal grandparents were a man named Morris. His Yiddish name was Moshko Gedala, and we know Gedala is a name in this family. We just talked about that Gedala ancestor, who was born in 1867, and Betty's maternal grandmother was named Fanny. Her Yiddish name was Fega Maresha, and who was born in 1866. And both of her grandparents were from Mezritch. Now, what's interesting about this family is that they moved entirely. The entire family moved to America. In 1898, Morris immigrated by himself. And then he brought his wife and his children in 1902. And so we have this picture over here of Morris and his wife Fanny and all of their children. And in the top right is their oldest daughter, who is Grandma Eva, who is Betty's mother. She had the Yiddish name Yensa Rivka. So Morris and Fanny, they had 6 children, as you can see here, and all of their descendants, primarily live in the United States today, and they came over at the turn of the 20th century. So I just wanted to include here some documents that later you can take a look through yourself more closely, but here is the marriage record of the grandparents in 1886. We have over here the 1902 arrival record in the U.S. for the wife and the kids. This is Fega right here. And this is Eva's mother, Yenta, who's listed arriving to the United States. This is her first record in the United States in 1902. And then it is interesting, but Morris Biederman, which was Betty's grandfather, he only became a naturalized citizen in the United States in 1932. This is, 34 years after he arrived in the United States. So you actually have his signature, Morris Biederman, here. And he worked as an umbrella maker. So we're now going to shift over to the other set of grandparents, the paternal grandparents of Betty. And we're going to spend some more time about the Nishka family because they primarily stayed in Mezritch. The Biedermans, they came to America. We're going to talk about Chaim Nositzer and Rivka Gittel-Vishnya, and their family primarily stayed in Mezritch. So who were the grandparents? Chaim Nositzer, born in 1856, and Rivka Gittel-Vishnya. And we have this wonderful picture from that I got from my grandparents We actually have a picture of what they look like. This is Chaim. This is Rivka Gittel around the 1920s. You can see that Rivka Gittel, they're very religious Jews. She is wearing a wig, which is called a sheitel. And we know that Chaim and Rivka Gittel had 10 children. They had 5 sons and 5 daughters. And in the Mezritch Yisker book, there is one picture of the family. And it's actually at Rivka Gittel's grave. Rivka Gittel died before the Holocaust in the 1930s. And the family is referred to as fur traders. So we believe that the Nishka family were in the fur trade, which is one of the 2 main industries in Mezritch. And over here, we have their marriage record from 1874. I have an appendix, and for both this marriage record and the marriage record of the Beermans, I have it fully translated in the appendix, where you can actually see the full translated record. So I want to take a step back here. We just talked about Chaim and Rivka Gittel over on this slide. I want to talk a little bit about Rivka Gittel because I have a very personal connection to her that I want to talk about, and it's the only, DNA stuff that I want to get into. So let's talk about eye color and how we inherit eye color. So because I am connected to Rivka Gittel through my eyes. So everyone inherits their eye color from both their parents, from both their father and their mother. And scientists have discovered that that on the human genome there are 3 billion base pairs of DNA, 3 billion. But some of them are functionally linked to physical characteristics. And one of them that's most directly linked is eye color. If you go to the 15th chromosome, you have 23 chromosomes, 22 autosomes, and a sex chromosome. But if you go to the 15th chromosome at marker around 28 million, you will see whether you have a pair of G's, a G and an A, or 2 A's. If you have 2 G's, which means you have a G from your father and a G from your mother, that means you will have some form of blue eyes 99% of the time, okay? If you have 1 A and 1 G, you're going to have brown eyes. And if you have 2 A's, most of the time, 80% of the time, you're going to have brown eyes. So really, if you have 1 G from each parent, that's the most, significant, you're going to have blue eyes. It turns out I have blue eyes, okay? Which means I have a G from my father and I have a G from my mother, okay? And I've confirmed this, okay? I've taken a DNA test. I've looked at exactly that point. Guess what? I have 2 G's. So it makes sense. That's why I have my blue eyes. Well, I have discovered who I inherited my mother's G from, okay? And that is through Rivka Gittel Vishna, that woman on that previous page who is my 3rd great-grandmother. She had the G. So how is that possible? How could I know that I inherited this G from her? That sounds pretty crazy. Well, what we do is we look at DNA matches from cousins. And we have on our call tonight Paula Scharfman and her mother, Ray Gutman. It turns out they share a huge segment of DNA with me on that chromosome 15, which includes this position over here, that 28 million mark. In other words, Paula and her mother inherited a G from the same ancestor that I did. And so how do we connect? Well, we connect through this Vishna family. They descend from a brother of Rivka Gittel, and I descend from Rivka Gittel. And so it must be that Rivka Gittel and her brother Simcha, who are Paula and Ray's ancestors, they inherited G from the same parent. We don't know which parent it was, but one of Rivka Gittel and Simcha's parents had a G that was passed down. And what's even more amazing, I think, and makes me feel more connected to this, is that Paula told me, through talking to her cousin and talking to other cousins from the Vishna family, is that this Vishna family that Rivka Gittel was a part of was known for having blonde hair and blue eyes. That was what they were known for. It was physical characteristics. And guess what? It is in me today. I inherited it from my grandmother, Anita. She has those blue eyes, that form of blue eyes too. And so, all of that G comes from Rivka Gittel, going back to the 1850s. It's pretty cool that you can do this type of work in the 21st century. All right. Let's go now to the history of Chaim Nozitzka's family. So, unlike the Beerman family, which I talked about, right? They immigrated to America, turn of the 20th century. They lived in America. Chaim Nozitzka and his family largely remained in Poland. In fact, I talked about there were 10 children. Boris Nositzer, who was Betty's father, was the fourth out of 10 children. He was the only one of his siblings to come to America, and he came in the first decade of the 1900s. And that would end up being a very fateful decision, because Chaim Nozitzka, which was Morris's father, and all 9 of his siblings, of Morris's siblings, and all 9 of Chaim Nozitzka's children would perish in the Holocaust. And all told, there were at least 46 members of our Nozitzka family who died in the Holocaust. I give some numbers: 22 in Treblinka, 13 in the Warsaw Ghetto, 7 in Mezritch, 3 in Majdanek, 1 in Auschwitz, and an additional 32 family from the Vishna side. So many, many people from our family were killed during the Holocaust. I've actually been to Poland as a teenager and have visited a lot of these sites. And this branch of my family is the only branch of my family that I know died in many of these death camps, especially Treblinka, Warsaw, and Majdanek. Probably the most emotional experience for me was visiting Majdanek, which was not destroyed and is a very emotional site. And I don't think I could have ever imagined that I had family members that perished there. So it's definitely emotional for me to think about that so many family members died during the Holocaust. And here what we have is this wonderful picture of the family. So this is at Rivka Gittel, who I got my blue eyes from. This is her gravesite. She died sometime between 1934 and 1939. I still don't know yet exactly when she died in the 1930s. But this is her husband, Chaim. And we see here all of the children and maybe a couple spouses. They're all visiting the gravesite. And we got this photo from a cousin who I recently connected with just in the last few years. Her name is Simma Reichman. We'll talk a little bit about her, but she lives in Israel, and she had this wonderful photo of the family at the gravesite. We actually, in the Mezritch History book, there's another photo from this exact same day, but it's not as good as this one. And in the appendix, I talk about it a little bit, where you see the Yisker book photo and this photo that Simma Reichman has. But everyone in this photo was murdered during the Holocaust. Everyone that's featured here. Okay. So with that introduction about the Nozitzka family, I want to talk about some of the surviving lines that we've reconnected with over the last few years. And I want to tell about some of their stories, because I think it's pretty remarkable. So out of the 10 children that Chaim and Rivka Gittel had, there were 3 children that have surviving lines today. 7 of them were completely wiped out. But obviously Boris Nositzer, his whole line is intact today. That's our family. But there were 2 other sisters, 2 older sisters, Simma and Esther Malka, Simma Rosen and Esther Malka Fitterman. They have descendants today who are still living. Now, both of these sisters died in the Holocaust, but they have descendants who did survive. So over here, Simma Reichman, who is a descendant of Simma, she's named after Simma, she sent me this photo of Simma and her husband and their children. So this is the family of one of Boris Nositzer's sisters, older sisters, taken obviously before the Holocaust. So I want to talk about one of the people I connected with, Simma Reichman, who is a granddaughter of that Simma. She is a second cousin of my grandmother, Anita, second cousin of Ellen and Harvey. And her mother came to Mandatory Palestine, what became Israel, right after the end of World War II from other places in Europe. and she already had other family living in Israel at that time. And Esther Rosen to Bachman, she had 2 children, Simma and Peretz, who still live in Israel today. And Esther, the mother, really kept a lot of records in her home, okay? So much so, and she was also very interested in family history. It's thanks to Simma's mother, Esther, that we have all this wonderful testimony about all of the family members that died in the Holocaust. In 1957, she wrote testimonies for so many family members, and it's a very important resource. So that's Simma's mother, who was Betty's first cousin. But they also kept other things. So they kept that photo that I mentioned before of the picture of the family, but they also had this picture, and I can see my great aunt Ellen smiling because this is a picture of her that was sent to Esther, to Simma's mother. This is a letter that was sent from Boris Nositzer to Esther, which was again Betty's first cousin, and it's a letter in Yiddish with Ellen's picture as a child. And it says, "This is your cousin. This is Bessie's middle daughter. Her father, Ellen's father is a doctor, and her name is Ellen, and she is similar to Simma." So what this letter is saying is Morris, right over here, is sending a picture of his granddaughter Ellen to Esther, and he's saying this is his niece Esther. And he's saying, look, my granddaughter is around the same age and is similar to your daughter, Simma. Incredible, right? We just connected in the last few years, and they had a picture of Ellen in her family home. And we reconnected, more than 60 years later. These families had been separated. So I think that's pretty remarkable. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the second sister that has surviving lines. We talked about Simmalea and her daughter Esther and granddaughter Simma Reichman, who had that wonderful photo. Now we're going to talk about 2 sub-branches of a sister named Esther Malka. Esther Malka was an older sister of Morris Nositzer, just a few years older than him. And she died in Treblinka, but she had descendants that survived. And we're going to talk about 2 of Esther Malka's grandchildren in particular. The first one is Aviva, and Esther Malka had a daughter named Fredel, who was born around 1910. And Fredel was married, and they had to a man named Beryl Manpearl, and they had a daughter who was born during the war. Okay, a daughter named Aviva, who was born in 1941 in the ghetto of Mezritch. Okay, she was a little baby born in Mezritch. And in 1942, while she was still a baby, Aviva's aunt, her name was Reina, who was Fredel's sister, Reina snuck Aviva over the ghetto walls into the non-Jewish part of the town, and Aviva was then hid in a family home, in a Polish family's home, with Aviva's father, Aviva's maternal aunt, Chaya Sarah, who we're going to talk about later, and Chaya Sarah's son, who was Aviva's first cousin, named Boris Shapiro. They were all hidden in a Polish family home, and this was all done in exchange for the family's jewelry. Okay, so again, Aviva's aunt snuck her over the wall. She was there with her father and her aunt and her cousin. And all 4 of them survived until June 1944, when the Soviets entered their hideout, entered the city and freed the city. So, Aviva entered the hideout. She was just 1 year old, 10 kilograms. She was 22 pounds. She was still at that weight more than 2 years later. So, somehow she miraculously survived. She was nursed back to health by the few survivors of Mezritch. And she's still alive today, and she lives in Israel. And this is what she looks like. Unfortunately, she has dementia today, but she has 4 children, and I've been in touch with 2 of her daughters. So there are these wonderful photos that Aviva's family has that have been preserved of her family. Again, these are Betty's first cousin. This is Betty's first cousin, Fredel, and her husband, Beryl. That's over here, Beryl Manpearl. And then in the bottom left, you see some of the first cousins, Betty's first cousins. These are the Federman cousins. And this is, in the background, this is Morris's sister, Esther Malka. And then we see here the father Beryl with one of the older sisters. So Aviva had two siblings who died during the war. Well, she had one who died before the war, a brother who was Simcha here. He died before the war, and then she had a sister named Leah who died in Treblinka. So she was the only one, along with her father, who survived. And we also have this incredible photo here on the bottom right. This is the Aunt Reina. You can see her wearing the Jewish Star of David on her arm that was required by Jews in the Mezritch ghetto, and she's holding her niece, Aviva, before, this is sometime before Reina snuck Aviva over the ghetto walls. So it's incredible that we have these photos of this family. It gets even more incredible, okay? Because Simma Reichman, the one who had the picture of Ellen, she had photos of Aviva at her house. And guess who was in these photos? Aviva here is in New York City, and she's being held by Morris over here, which is Betty's father, Morris Nositzer, and Betty's mother, Eva Biederman Nositzer. So we see here that Simma Reichman had a picture of Aviva, the Holocaust survivor, in New York. So what happened? So what we know is that after the war, Aviva spent some time in a camp in Germany, and then, thanks to Morris Nositzer, okay, he brought Aviva and Aviva's cousin and Aviva's cousin's parents to New York City. He sponsored them to come to New York City. And I know, for instance, that Aviva's cousin Boris lived with Morris. It could also very well be that Aviva lived for some time with Morris and Eva after the war in New York. So she was only about 5 or 6 years old when she came to America, and she spoke a lot of different languages, Yiddish, Polish, and German. And in her retelling of the story, before Aviva had dementia, when she would talk about it, she would talk about her time in New York City. Those years in New York City were some of her happiest years. She was able to live a good childhood in New York City. She had her aunt, Chaya Sora, was a mother figure to her, and she had a cousin, Boris, who was like a brother to her. But her father, who did not come to America, he survived, but he went to Israel. He remarried, and eventually he wanted his daughter back with him. And so in 1949, Aviva left New York City and moved to Israel. And she had a very difficult time adjusting to life in the very early days of the state of Israel. It was a very different time in Israel's history. So again, Aviva continues to live in Israel today. She has 4 children, several grandchildren, and I've connected with two of Aviva's daughters. But I just thought these pictures were remarkable. Okay, Morris Nositzer clearly had sent these photos to his cousin Esther, who he was in touch with, and we see here Aviva smiling with our family. Okay, we're going to keep going here, and we're going to talk about Aviva's cousin, who also descends from Esther Malka, and first cousin named Boris Shapiro. He was born Baruch Shtapochnik, and he is Anita, my grandmother's second cousin, and he is Aviva's first cousin. So I briefly mentioned a little bit about him, that he was born in Warsaw, but then he came to Mezritch, and he was living with his cousin Aviva in that hideout home. So they were living together for a few years, surviving, and they survived the war together in this hideout home. Boris is still alive, and he gave an interview back in the late 1990s, in 1998, about 25 years ago. He gave an interview where he talks about his survival, and he was in the hideout with his cousin, but there's a really miraculous part of his story that precedes going to the hideout. And so on this next slide, we're going to spend the next 15 minutes, and we're going to listen to Boris Shapiro talk in his own words about what happened when there was a roundup of Jews. Remember, he was 5 years old. He has memories. He has memories of this time, and he talks about it. And he talks about it again. He's going to talk about himself, and he's going to talk about his mother. His mother is Betty's first cousin, and I think you'll have a deep appreciation for his mother after this story. So, I am going to start. It's 2 separate clips. It's about 15 minutes. There is, the content is going to be maybe a little bit difficult, but I think it is very important that you hear it because his story is quite miraculous and moving. So let's get started.
And it was during this roundup, and I recall going with my mother to a railroad station in Mezritch. This all took place in Mezritch. And I recall an open plaza, like an open area in front of a railroad station, where there were many people, some suitcases, some hand luggage, that kind of thing. And I recall a table with Gestapo people there. And then my memory skips to being actually on the train, in the cattle car. The train was going to Treblinka. And the train was very heavily packed with people. It was sardine-like, as the expression goes. People were dying there from suffocation. People were underfoot. People were stepping on each other. People were reaching towards and fighting for the slits in the cattle car for some air. And these were all people from Mezritch. And there was one person on there. Every time I told my mother that I remembered this, she was always surprised and saying, how do you remember that? And I remember I had a pair of leather boots that my grandfather made for me. And when we went on that train, I was wearing those boots. And when we were in the train, obviously, people were just packed against each other. And there was an individual there, like an older person, who was trying to pull them off my foot. It was like he was attempting to steal them from me. And when I relayed that image to my mother, she says, yes, that's actually what happened. And she says, I don't understand how you remember that, So I would say that some of the other images that I have are also actual recollections of what happened, because she confirmed some of those, as I said, as I relayed them to her, because we would occasionally just sit and talk, and she enjoyed talking about it.
When was this?
This after we came to the States. She enjoyed talking about it. Maybe it was like a catharsis, and she liked to tell the children about it, to relay the story.
To which?
To my children, to Barry and Audrey, to relay the story. And we would sit at the kitchen table, and she would relate some of those things. And she had no reservation about doing that. I think she wanted children to know what happened, and maybe I really haven't analyzed it, but I could say that maybe it was a catharsis for her. She, to talk about that.
And what about for you?
Well, I enjoyed listening to her too. She was a very good storyteller. She had a lot of detail. Some of the detail kind of just, as a child goes over your head. You're not really listening to every detail, but she had everything down pat, and she could tell you who the people were and very specific things about their lives and relationships and so on. But let me just go back, because I was telling you about the train to Treblinka. So I remember that I lost my boot because he was pulling it off me. It was it was, as I recall, it was stifling and hot and tremendous thirst on the part of people. And people were like, you could, like, almost fighting for their lives. And people were on the ground, kind of almost suffocated, you know. And we left for Treblinka. The train left, actually left for Treblinka. And it would make occasional stops along the way for whatever reason. And things kind of calmed down. You know, at the beginning when we got on the train, there's a lot of panic and a lot of commotion, you know. And then things kind of quieted down. And the train stopped along the way. And at one point, at one of these interim stops, my mother found a hole in the floor of the car, of the car that we were in. And she went for the hole and left the car. She lowered herself from that cattle car and took me with her. And as she tells the story, she says she lowered herself head first. She said, if they're going to kill me, let them hit me in the head first. So she was very fatalistic. As she relayed during, you know, these storytelling periods, she was very much aware of what was happening to people, where they were going. And she tells of people who were unwilling or unable to accept the fact that people were being shipped to extermination camps. And she would say, you know, she would like tell and you know, relate and say, Herschel, don't you know what's going on? Don't you know where we're going? Don't you know where these people are? And so on. So that as she tells it, she was aware and certainly more accepting of the information that was filtering back to the town as to what was happening to people. But as she also says, there were a lot of people who were just unwilling or unable to accept the fact that the people were going to extermination camps. So she was very fatalistic. And I guess that's why she said she lowered herself head first. So that's what she did. She lowered herself from the train.
Do you recall that?
I recall parts of it. I recall, I could see the hole.
What was the hole look like? How big was it?
Just big enough for an individual to let themselves down. Maybe 4 feet wide, that kind of thing.
And was it a hole for a purpose, a mechanical purpose?
No. It appears to have a hole that just developed as a result of traffic or something else, you know, a damage in the car. It wasn't meant for an exit. It wasn't an exit hole, as I recall it.
Did your mother say anything to you before she went head first?
Not that I recall. I don't recall any conversation about that.
Where did she land? Where did both of you land?
Well, she lowered herself from the car, and we went onto the tracks. And she took me down, and she started to walk.
Now, were you in view of the other people in the car?
I would imagine. I don't recall, but remember I said that a calm overtook the car after a period, whatever period it was, of travel, so that the panic and the hysteria, which I recall very specifically at the beginning, suddenly it wasn't there. It's like whoever died, whoever was exhausted, and whatever people were doing, but it was a kind of quiet.
Were there people who followed you?
No. I don't know why.
Was this day or night?
Night.
And what time of year was it?
It wasn't winter. Okay, it was either fall or something, but it wasn't winter.
This ends tape.
So we lowered ourselves from the train. It was night, very quiet. I hear the train. When a train stops, you have that hissing sound, and I hear that, and it's the only sound that I hear. And there's no one around, nobody around. And my mother takes me by the hand, and we start walking away from the train. And I recall she would tell me, she didn't turn around. She said, if they're going to shoot me, let them shoot me. Okay? And she just kept walking. And I don't know how long it was, but my next recollection of it is we approached the farmhouse. We found a farmhouse. And we heard it from a distance. People throwing a bucket down the well, and a variety of sounds that would emanate from a dwelling and a farm and so on. And we approached that farmhouse, and for some reason, the farmer was friendly. The farmer was friendly, and I recall him sending us to the hayloft, and we went up to the hayloft. And my mother was wearing a number of garments. As I understand it also, during times of pogrom, people would put on layers of clothing and carry on their bodies whatever they could. And she would take off a dress and give it to the farmer as a kind of payment. I saw the diary of Anne Frank on Wednesday, and one of the things that caught my eye, I think it was purposeful on the part of the production, is when Anne Frank's sister was in the attic, and the family first entered the attic, and they were getting settled and so on. Anne Frank's sister Margot started to undress, and I saw that she had several garments on her, and immediately, that connection was made. It became, I noticed that right away. I don't know if other people would have noticed that. So she gave the farmer one of her garments, and then I vaguely recall the farmer, like on the following day, or perhaps 2 days later, I don't recall the actual time, he took us by buggy to the train station. And he put us on a train back to Mezritch. And we went back to Mezritch. And I recall being on that train. I recall my mother standing next to the bathroom with a kerchief on her head. Being very frightened. Being frightened that somebody would recognize her because she's going back to a place where everybody knows her. And being afraid that we would be recognized as Jews. But fortunately, I was blonde when I was young, and I didn't look Jewish. So she felt somewhat comfortable in the sense that that particular aspect would not reveal us as not being Jewish. But I see her standing with a kerchief, on her head. And we returned to Mezritch on the train after leaving that train, which eventually went to Treblinka. And as people know, people who went to Treblinka didn't come back. So it was a miraculous thing. And I like to tell people, when we talk about the Holocaust and relate some of the experiences and so on, because I really believe that these are miracles, because I don't know how many people escaped from trains to Treblinka. So these are miracles, and I think every survivor has a story which reveals some kind of miracle because it's not logical. It's just something that happened. I and my cousin, my infant cousin, are the only two surviving children from Mezritch out of a population, I understand, of maybe 10,000 or more Jewish families. And we were the only two children to have survived. So, how do you explain that? It has to be a miracle. And certainly, being able to leave the train is a miracle. And that, my mother was a very strong person, very determined, very focused, unafraid. And I think that's what allowed us to escape, or to use this opportunity. Because, like you were asking, where were the other people? I don't know where they were, but I'm sure they weren't all sleeping and they weren't all unaware. But the fear, I would imagine, was so great that people just didn't have the strength to take a chance, you know. And yet my mother did. And certainly it says something about her character and about her strength and about her determination. And these are characteristics which I recall, and these are the characteristics which made it possible for us to live through the experience after the war, to come to the United States, to have some very difficult times when we came to the United States. She wasn't discouraged. She was, you know, she was, things were hard, but she wouldn't allow herself to be discouraged, and she took advantage of opportunities, and these are things I recall about her.
All right. So that was the 15-minute clip of Boris Shapiro. I hope you all can appreciate now why I wanted to include this clip in the presentation. In all of my research, my lines of ancestry, I've never come across a story like this one that was so miraculous. You really paints a picture of who his mother was like, someone he greatly admired, who was, again, Betty's first cousin. This is only 15 minutes of the interview. The interview is about 2 hours in length. You can go to the USC Shoah Foundation Institute website. You can order it yourself if you're interested, or if I have them on my computer as well. If you would like to have the videos for the full interview for Boris Shapiro, again, you can see how reflective and thoughtful he is in just this 15-minute clip. Please let me know, and I'll be more than happy to send you the full interview. But again, really quite a miraculous story, and he is still alive in New York City. I have connected with him via email, and he ended up living with Morris and Eva for almost, I think, a year, and he had very warm things to say about our grandpa Morris Nositzer during that time that he lived with him. So again, all these individuals that, you know, he lived with Grandpa Morris, Morris brought him over to the United States. All these families were connected with us, not in the not so distant past, and it's been very special for me to reconnect with some of these branches of our family. Okay, so now taking a step back, we've talked about Chaim and Rivka's descendants. I wanted to sort of provide a visual from the tree of what was lost due to the Holocaust, okay? Sometimes a visual helps paint the picture. So what you see here is, over here is Chaim and Rivka. These are all their descendant branches on the tree. And I'm going to point out to you what they are. So over here, this big green box, that's our branch of the family. We have Betty, Sadie, and Sammy, all three of their children, all of their descendants. Yes, all of you guys are on the tree. You can probably, if you squint, you can see your pictures here. This is through my mother's generation, so I am not on here. With the younger generations, I just wanted this to be illustrative. But what you see with Morris's line, which again was largely intact, is you see it building and expanding, right, and getting bigger and bigger as the generations go on. Right, there were three children. Each of them had more children, and then look at all of those great-grandchildren and then great-great-grandchildren. The tree has grown exponentially over time. Now let's go to The older sister, who was Simma Reichmann's grandmother, Simma Leah, you see a bit of a different structure here, right? You have living descendants that are today, but it's much more narrow. You had a lot of children that Simma Leah had. Most of them died in the Holocaust, but you have some surviving lines, right? It's starting to build out again, but it's gotten narrower. And you see something very similar here with Esther Malka Fitterman, who had her granddaughter was Aviva Manpearl and also Boris Shapiro. Those are the two people who were in the hideout together. Again, there was a wider to start, and it's gotten smaller because so many of the descendants passed away in the Holocaust. But it is starting to rebuild here as well. And then, lastly, we have the 7 other children. These are just 3 branches of the family. We have the remaining 7, an older brother named Hershko, and then younger siblings. All of Morris's 6 younger siblings perished in the Holocaust. All of them had families. All of them perished, and their lines don't exist. And this is sort of like a stark visualization here of what has been lost in this family. This family tree could be so big right today. This is just 3 surviving lines and only one that was all intact. And instead, it's a much smaller family today because of the destruction that happened during the Holocaust. And just from these red boxes alone, from these people, we're talking about 30, 40 people that are on this tree. Just from this Rivka, Gittel, and Chaim Nozitzka's descendants. Okay, we still have a few more minutes here. I've got a few more slides here. I know we're getting close to an hour and a half, but I knew it was going to be a longer presentation. I'm going to spend just a few more slides talking about the extended Mezritch family. Up until now, we just talked about Grandma Betty's grandparents, both sets of grandparents and their descendants. Now we're going to go a little bit further back in time to other cousins that are on the extended family. And what I want to highlight here, and it's going to be a focus, is that our family, we're going to see documentation and other things that show how we were connected to all these people in the not so distant past. Even though they're they're one generation or more distant, there are still connections that are clearly seen in the data, in the documentation. So first I want to talk about the extended Nozitzka family. So that is Morris Nositzer's father's family, an extended family. So I think it's important to say that even though Chaim, who was Betty's paternal grandfather, Chaim Nozitzka, even though his branch of the family stayed in Mezritch, Chaim had brothers that came to America. He had a brother named Louis Norman, who was born Lazar Nozitzka, and he had a brother named Morris Norman, born Moshko Aron Nozitzka, who both of these younger brothers of Chaim, they immigrated to the United States. And in fact, when Betty's father, Morris, immigrated to America in 1908, he was going to his uncle's house. Chaim's brother's house is Louis Norman's house, and we see that in the 1908 record. We also have other extended Nozitzka family members that came to America. So Chaim had a first cousin named Barnett Nositzer, and he was born Berko David. And Barnett's grandson was a guy named Bernard D., who was named after his grandfather. And Bernard D. Nositzer was a prize-winning economics reporter for the Washington Post. And Bernard's son, whose name is Adam Nositzer, who's still alive, he has been a bureau chief for the New York Times all over the world, including Kabul, Paris, West Africa, and New Orleans. So what you see here, I've talked about people with the Norman surname, people with the Nositzer surname. Almost all of the Nozitzka surname descendants who came to America, they changed their name. None of them kept Nozitzka because that's too hard to pronounce in English. Some went with Norman, like Chaim's 2 brothers, or they went with Nositzer, which was that Chaim's cousin that we talked about, Barnett. And it turns out that Morris decided to go with the Nositzer name, but Morris's son ended up taking the surname of Norman, Sammy Norman. So those are basically 2 different surnames that Nozitzka transformed into. And one of Louis Norman, who is Chaim Nozitzka's brother's descendants, is married to a woman named Eleanor O'Hanrahan, who was born in Ireland, and but she's been living in America for a while now, and she's really into genealogy. she put together this wonderful book that she sent to me called The Norman Nositzer Nishka Family. It's a huge book talking about our extended Nishka family, focused mainly on the different American branches, including her husband's ancestor, who was this Louis Norman, who, again, Grandpa Morris was going to his home when he immigrated to America. So it's a really wonderful book about the extended Nishka family. I invited Eleanor to come to the presentation tonight, but she is in Ireland right now this month, and it's very late there. All right. So just some, again, relationship charts so you can graphically see how are we connected to these people. So I just mentioned here, this is Adam Nositzer, who is editor of the New York Times. He is born in 1960. He's actually the same generation, though, as my grandmother, Anita. So even though he's so much younger, he is her fourth cousin. But again, he has the Nositzer surname still. And to Eleanor, whose husband is Anita's third cousin, Robert Benjamin, who, again, Eleanor has done a really wonderful job researching our family. She found this record in particular. This is Morris Nositzer's arrival in America in 1908. He's listed as Moishe Nositsky, and he is coming to visit over here Louis Louis Norman, who is his uncle, and that is Eleanor's husband's great-grandfather. All right. So we talked about the extended Nositzer family. Now we're going to talk about some of the extended Vishna family, and we have on the call tonight some of these extended family members. Paula Gutman Scharfman and her mother Ray Gutman. She was born Ray Feldman. Ray is Betty's second cousin, and Paula is my grandmother's third cousin. So they descend from Rivka Gittel's younger brother named Simcha Vishna. And Simcha married a woman named Resha Lichtenberg, and they had 5 daughters. But both Simcha and his wife passed away at a young age, and they had 5 orphan daughters, and all 5 daughters came to America. So Ray's mother was one of those daughters, Fradel, and so the family lived in New York, but eventually, Paula, the granddaughter of Freda, she came to Baltimore, and her family and my family have known each other for many years. She's, in fact, very close with some of my cousins on my dad's side, and I went to college with Paula's daughter, and it was only recently from a DNA test that we realized, oh, we're actually cousins too. So it's pretty exciting for me when I know people from elsewhere in the world and find out that they're also relatives. And Paula and her mother, they both inherited that G from their ancestor Simcha. I inherited that G from my ancestor Rivka Gittel. And even though Paula has brown eyes because she received an A from her father, she has passed down her G to her children, and many of her children have blue eyes, and they all come from, again, 50% of that come from the same ancestor as my blue eyes come from. So I also enjoy that aspect about these relatives. And it's really special to have them on the call here. Paula, I just want to give a shout out to her. She is really into genealogy, and I've done a lot of work with her. She's been a wonderful collaborator, and she did a lot of editing work on this presentation. So you can thank her for for not having as many spelling mistakes as I had when I first sent her this presentation. This is a picture of the Vishna sisters. These are the 5 daughters and their mother, Resha, circa 1910. So this is before the mother died, but this is most likely after the father, Simcha Vishna, died. These are the 5 daughters. And again, I talk about, there's connections to these branches of the family. Well, guess what? One of the daughters, one of these sisters, was named Frances Vishna. And when she becomes a naturalized citizen of the United States, who is her witness? None other than Morris Nositzer. And we have Morris's signature right here. So he was in touch with all of these sisters and these families. And again, this took place in 1930. So again, it's amazing to see these connections when you go out and look for them. Okay, we're almost done. But I want to spend just a couple slides here talking about other connections. And what's special about these connections is they are connected to multiple families of ours. Okay, so because so much of our ancestry, so much of Betty's ancestry comes from one community, the community of Mezritch, it's not so surprising to find relatives who are connected through different lines. And I found a few of them, so I'll mention two of them. One is a woman named Batya Minsky Diamond, and she's a connection I only found through DNA. The only way I could have ever found her was through DNA. And she shares a ton of DNA with me. And with my grandmother, and I was like shocked by it. So I looked into her line. She mentioned that she was from Mezritch. Her family was from Mezritch. It turns out she's a fourth cousin to my mom in two completely separate ways, from the Beerman family and the Weinstein family. So both from Grandma Eva's side, but two different lines, completely different connections. And Batya then sent me, so that is why there's so much DNA, is because there's multiple connections. It shows up as a closer DNA match than you would otherwise would expect. And incredibly, Batya sent me letters in Yiddish from the 1920s and 1930s that her Beerman family in Poland, they were living in a nearby town at that time called Siedlce, that mention Betty's maternal grandfather, Morris Beerman. There are letters that are saying, oh, send my regards to Morris Beerman, okay, from this ancestors of hers. So again, our family is being mentioned in these letters from the 1920s and 1930s. The second person who I'm going to mention briefly is a girl who lives in Chicago. She's, I think, still in middle school. Her name is Emma Wishna, and her great-grandfather is the one who we heard on the line at the very beginning of the presentation. Her great-grandfather, Irving Wishna, was a Holocaust survivor. His story was that he was able to make it to Russia right at the very beginning of the war, and he was in various labor camps in Russia, but that is what allowed him to survive. And he came to America eventually, and they have a big family, a big Wishna family. I think his son, Stephen, who is a close DNA match. I also had discovered this family through DNA, through Emma's grandfather, Stephen. He lives, I think, in Tennessee. And Emma lives in Chicago with her family. And she's also very passionate about genealogy research and has sent me a lot of things from her family. So this has been just a visualization of just one of the ways that we're connected. So I'm connected to Emma Wishna in 3 different families, which is crazy. From the Nositzer side, Wishna family, and from the Biebergel family. So she's actually on the right-hand side. That we're connected through a few different ways, but one of the ways that we're connected is through Rivka Gittel's brother, Hershko Yankel. He was a very prominent merchant in Mezritch, and many of his descending lines are no longer survive, but there are a few of them. I've been in touch with a few different descendants of Hershko Yankel, and that's one way that we're connected. But again, I'm a 5th cousin in 2 ways and a 6th cousin in a 3rd way to Emma. And then Batya Minsky Diamond is my mother's 4th cousin in 2 different ways. I show one of the ways here, which is through Morris Beerman's sister, Pesya. And I mention this connection in particular because Pesya lived in Poland, and she wrote letters to her son, Jacob Minsky, and she mentions her brother Morris in these letters. So I have got 25 pages of these letters that have been translated too. I just include just a couple snapshots of these letters. They're very interesting to read. They're written by Pesya and her husband to her son. And again, Pesya was Morris Beerman's sister. And she'll say, please send my regards to Moshe Gedala. That is Morris Beerman. She's saying, please pass on my, regards to my brothers. One of them was Benjamin, another one was Moshe Gedala, which is Morris Beerman. And she mentions our ancestor in a lot of these Yiddish letters that she wrote in the 1920s and 1930s. You can get a sense for her heart. She had a lot of hardship later in life. She was blind. She was very poor. They talk a lot about asking for money and getting sent money from the States. So you see that a lot in her letters. But I was stunned to find that Morris Beerman, this is Betty's grandfather, is being mentioned in these letters. Remember, he left for America in 1898. This is 25, 30 years later, and he's getting mentioned in these letters that his sister writes to her son. All right, so we're at the end of the presentation here. It was a little over an hour and a half. I knew it would be around this length. But just to summarize what we've talked about tonight. So Betty Nositzer Brandner, she's my great-grandmother. Her ancestry is largely from the community of Mezritch in eastern Poland. There's extensive vital records that exist from Mezritch, which has allowed us to build out so many different lines of Betty's direct ancestry. And practically every single line of Betty's ancestry extends back into the 1700s. We know every single name to people who were born in the 1700s across every single line, which is remarkable. Betty's family, especially her father's family, the Nositzer and Vishna family, they were ravaged by the Holocaust, and more so than any other family in my own ancestry. Chaim Nositzer, who was Betty's grandfather, is the only direct ancestor of mine to have perished in the Shoah. And, it's been emotional for me to learn about this family and to do this research. And then finally, I've been able to connect with many different lines of this Mezritch family. Hopefully you've seen that there are a lot of people that I've connected with over this, and there are going to be a lot more people who I'm going to meet in the future because I have not built out all of the different descending lines. I would say the tree is best built from 1800 to like 1860. Like that tree is very well built, but a lot of the descending lines have not been fully built out. And so I fully expect to find more cousins. And a lot of it's going to come from DNA. I'm actually pretty hopeful that through DNA, we'll be able to find out a lot more cousin lines and be able to build out the tree further. Separate from this, there's a couple other DNA things I would love to be able to research. And that is looking at the ancient history of some of our paternal lines and maternal lines. So I mentioned, some people with the surname Nositzer and some people with the surname Vishna today. If we can take male individuals from them, we could do Y-DNA tests and look at the ancient history of the Vishna line and ancient history of the Nositzer line. But what we can do today is already know about the maternal line, because my maternal line is the same line that Betty's maternal line is, because I descend through the direct maternal line, and I've already done testing about my maternal line, and I didn't feel like it was worth it to add a few more slides about it in this presentation. So maybe I'll save it for another presentation, but it's really fascinating about the maternal line. It's been a subject of a research article from 2016, and it's widely talked about because it's a rather unique line, maternal line in Ashkenazi Jewish lines. But that will be for another day. So I'll conclude here just to thank everyone. There are a lot of people. Obviously, this is genealogy research is a collaborative effort. I've been building off a lot of this work off of a lot of other people's work, not just my own. So I want to thank my grandparents, Howard and Anita, who've supplied so much wonderful information for me, to Anita's cousin, Howard Enton, who's been also incredible. He has memories, and he might want to share them on the video, of going to his grandparents' house, going to Morris and Eva's house, and sending care packages to their family in Israel. So he has real memories of this connection after the Holocaust to Morris's family members in Israel. I want to thank Eleanor O'Hanrahan, who's been incredible, really an incredible researcher, to Simma Reichman, Rinat Ben-Nun, very much so to Paula Scharfman, who is on this call. She's incredible and really has done incredible research, to Batya Minsky-Diamond, and to Emma Wishna, among many others. A few other people I want to cite, just Max Wald. He has provided me with some pictures of some of these early records from Mezritch that are not widely available online. You can find them online, but they're a little bit harder to get. And he provided some summaries of the information in those records. So I want to thank him. He's a volunteer for an organization called JRI Poland, which is a great website for doing research for Jewish genealogy in Poland. And I've found a lot of different things about my family thanks to that organization. And then lastly, I want to thank this woman named Bella Marianchik, who I haven't talked to much, but have corresponded a little bit. She lives in Europe. I believe she lives in Poland. And she found all these incredible early records from the Beerman family. She was the one who discovered the Beerman-Bavelstein connection and between these different surnames. So a lot of people to thank, and maybe before I stop the screen share, or maybe I'll stop the video, I just want to briefly go through some of the appendix here. Because I do have extra slides. What I will do after the presentation is send you guys a link so you can download the presentation. But I do want to show that I have a few other slides with just some additional content. The first is, if you want to learn more about Mezritch, I have some resources here about history, about the Yizkor book. If you want to see the film in Hebrew, you can see that. There are two important Facebook groups of descendants of people from Mezritch, one in English and one in Hebrew. I have some maps so you can see what the city of Mezritch looks like. It's the name Międzyrzec in Mezritch in Polish actually means between the rivers, which is the same name as Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia in Greek means between the rivers. Mesopotamia is the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Mezritch, the town, was actually founded between two rivers. They're not as mighty as the Tigris and the Euphrates, but you can see these two rivers here and where the city is located. Thought that was interesting. I have translations of marriage records. This is Chaim and Rivka Gittel. This is their marriage record that I have translated, and a good image of it as well. I have the maternal grandparents, their marriage record, and this has been translated as well. It is interesting here to seeing some of the differences. They cite here that the bride and groom and their fathers are illiterate in this document. And then this is a wonderful record I found just this week. That is a population register from 1934, and it shows that Chaim and Rivka Gittel were still alive. Rivka Gittel, we now know, must have passed away between 1934 and 1939, but she's still listed as living here. And we even learn about occupations in a document like this. So Chaim is listed as being dependent on his children. So he is getting close to age 80 and he's no longer working. And then again, this is this side-by-side photo from the same day from Rivka Gittel's grave. My grandfather had sent me this photo from the Mezritch Yizkor book over here. And you can see Simma Reichman had a much better quality photo of the same family on the same day at the same grave. And pretty amazing that we have two photos from totally different sources of that family. And then a link here to learn about Yad Vashem testimonies that mostly Esther Rosen Tabachman provided. And then some pictures of our family. So we have Morris and Eva and her 3 children. We can see Betty over here. And this is Morris and Eva's wedding record, marriage record in America. We have a picture of Betty on her wedding day. That's a famous photo of her. It's one of my favorite photos of her. And we have her marriage record in New York City to Bernard Brandner. And a picture of their home from Brooklyn that I got from a cool website where you can find any address in New York City and see pictures of them from the 1940s and 1980s. You can put in any address, and every building in New York City was photographed, and you can see older photos. And what's nice about this is that this building no longer exists. It was torn down after Betty moved out, and so we actually can see photos of it online over here. And with that, I am going to just stop the end the show for a second. Just a second.